Welcome back, and time now for our Saturday expert panel. And joining me today from Sydney, Sam Crosby from the McKell Institute, and in Melbourne, Daniel Wild from the Institute of Public Affairs. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Notable during the week that Christian Porter, Social Services Minister, suggesting big changes, flying kites at the very least, about big changes to welfare policy, suggesting going down something of a New Zealand path, using big data to identify efficiencies and the need for changes, etc., etc. Daniel, to you, first of all, in promoting this new ideal, if I can put it that way, for dealing with welfare, Mr Porter was suggesting that he wasn't driven either by ideology or any budget parameters, suggesting that cutting costs was not what he's about. From where you sit, you'd have to be pretty disappointed if that's the way it were to turn out, wouldn't you?
Well, Christian Porter made a very good case in emphasising the moral dimensions of the need for welfare reform. The budget problems are fairly well understood and well known, that about 48% of people in this country are net tax receivers, and that goes to some issues relating to the long-term sustainability of our welfare system. But more fundamental to that is the large foregone human potential and foregone human capital that welfare represents. And I think Christian Porter was right to emphasise the moral virtues of work and the importance of achieving self-sufficiency and self-reliance. And any change to welfare needs to be based on the understanding that the fundamental underpinning of human flourishing is earned success. That is the fundamental basis of achieving lasting and just satisfaction with life. And so moving people from welfare into work has a strong moral dimension as well as a strong economic dimension.
But if he's not about cutting costs, why would he have used a figure of $4.8 trillion as the lifetime cost of not doing anything about changes to welfare? Sounded like he was trying to frighten people into supporting the proposals he was promoting.
Well, there are large costs to welfare. $4.8 trillion is a large lifetime cost, and the key thing is that welfare is targeted towards those who need it most, those who are on the lowest incomes and those who are otherwise incapacitated and unable to work, or who have a disability. When welfare goes beyond being provided to those people, the costs stack up, and as the costs stack up, that begins to undermine the financial sustainability of the welfare system. So it is right to bring to people's attention the costs, the economic costs and the costs to the budget, but overlaying that with the importance, the moral importance of work and the human costs associated with welfare, I think is the right approach.
Sam Crosby, do you agree with Daniel on the question of the moral dimension and effectively the dignity and value of work, and that there are welfare traps in the current system that do need rectifying so that people do get a genuine opportunity to shift from benefits to work, and that being the case, that there is something honourable in the sense of what Christian Porter is at least suggesting and opening up the whole argument?
Look, I'm a big fan of Christian Porter. I'll be interested to see where this debate goes. And I think it started on down the right track. You know, you're right, emphasising the need that these people have as individuals to get off the dole and get out of welfare and get into productive work is the right way to go. When the conversation devolves into a sort of, you know, bash the dole bludger sort of tone, which frankly people like Scott Morrison are chomping at the bit to go down that road, that's when you start to open up real wedges in the community, political wedges with the Labor Party. That's when you lose your bipartisan goodwill, if you like. I got to say, though, I think this idea that somehow you can cut money from the welfare budget in the short term and drive positive behaviours is completely wrong-headed. The reason that it's so hard to get these people off the dole and into work, it's expensive. it's time consuming. It's going to take a multi-government, multi-layered government approach to do this. You know, the housing portfolio is absolutely critical and central to this. You know, you can't take tens of thousands of people, as is in the case of, say, the Everleigh site in Sydney, all of whom, or not all of whom, that's wrong, but many of whom are unemployed, many of whom have drug or alcohol dependency issues, and put them all together and expect them, you know, to somehow develop role models and their children to develop role models and break out of that. Of course, you need to salt and pepper this approach throughout the city. Now, that's a state government responsibility funded by the federal government, but you have to engage at all levels with this program and with this problem. Otherwise, you're just going to have a cheap conversation.
Indeed, Daniel, difficult, expensive and takes a long time. That's quite right. Many governments have tried to move people off welfare into work, and while there's been a degree of success, and indeed as a proportion of the budget, spending on welfare is down on the moment what it was 15 years ago, but it is difficult, expensive and very time consuming.
Well, there are two sides to this. So on the one side is the issues associated with the dependency that the current welfare approach can create, which is through the high effective marginal tax rates then are generated when people try to move from welfare and into work. So actually reducing that component will go a long way to removing those impediments to moving into employment.
So what does that mean, lifting thresholds?
It means making sure that when people are moving off benefits and back into work, that their effective tax rates aren't so high as to completely discourage that happening. Now, on the other side, there's a situation where we have a relatively high tax economy, both on incomes and on companies, particularly when we take into account superannuation. And we also have a significant amount of regulation and red tape. Now, on that side, it creates more of a stifling economic environment for job creation to happen. So on the one hand, we have disincentives for people to enter work and enter the labour market, and on the other hand, we have disincentives for jobs to be created. So both sides need to be tackled.
And indeed, Sam Crosbie, they do, but as you're suggesting, it's easier said than done.
Well, that's right. I mean, look, this has been tried, you know, countless times by Labor, by Liberal, you name it. I disagree that there's a problem with the low marginal tax rate and getting people off the dole. I don't think that's it at all. I think in a lot of cases it results in it necessitates training and entry to work programs. In a lot of cases, it's you know, you need to find a way to remove these people from their situation where they're the only person in their community with a job. You know, you can't expect one person out of a community of 20 people to be the only one to get a job. That's just not going to happen.
And Sam Crosbie, what about Christian Porter's focus on the New Zealand model, which does employ or has employed big data to effectively disaggregate and break down exactly the challenges that people face in these groups that are vulnerable to being on welfare effectively for the entire period of their lives? Is he wise to be heading in this direction?
Oh, look, I think it's certainly not unwise. Whether it's wise or not, I don't know. I will say this: welfare is one of the most analysed, studied, reviewed areas of public policy. The idea of using big data, frankly, it's not new, but it's not unwelcome. So, look, the more analysis, the more data, fine. But at the end of the day, we know what the problems are in a lot of these cases. It's not about diagnosing any more problems. It's about actually fixing some things.
Might move on to education briefly and stick with you too, Sam. We heard Education Minister Simon Birmingham met the states yesterday about trying to tidy up, if I can put it that way, the consequences of the introduction of the Gonski agenda. Didn't meet much support from around the states, except from those that might benefit from reducing the expenditure of some other states. So you did have Western Australia saying this is a terrific idea, but that too is going to prove more easier said than done, is it not?
Yeah, look, I think the problem that they have with this one is for the last 3 years they've been so disingenuous with Gonski. You know, of course, at the last election, sorry, the previous election in 2013, going to the election saying, you know, Labor and the Liberals are on a unity ticket. Of course, that next budget getting in and cutting years 4 and 5, the expensive years of Gonski. And then pretending that there was no problem, nothing to see here. It's eroded the trust and the ability that they have to go out and actually cut a deal with the states and, frankly, with the Australian public. We just don't buy them when it comes to education.
No, they certainly weren't bought at the last election, were they, Daniel? And this is an enduring problem for the coalition, which is to regain credibility as far as education. It's a long time since Sir Robert Menzies and the days of abolishing state aid where the coalition had the ascendancy on this issue, and it's as much about credibility as anything else, and the 2014 budget didn't help them as far as that's concerned.
It is a perennial problem for the coalition when it comes to education policy. What is clear is, just as in the context of welfare, simply providing more money is not going to provide better outcomes to our education system. There's been a 14% increase in the per-student expenditure over the last decade, and this has not been met with a substantial improvement in results as measured by the NAPLAN test. What is needed, and I think there is an opportunity for the coalition to move away from focusing just on the dollars and cents and just on the money in and move towards reform and results. That would come through, for an instance, making sure that funding is more directed towards the users of education rather than funding going directly to states and going from states to schools.
But wasn't that the intention of Gonski, that it was the pupil first, needs-based?
It needs to be done in a universal manner that facilitates more competition in the education market in places such as Sweden, where they have more expansive choice through school vouchers programs that allows empowerment of families and individuals and students who have the most at stake in the success of the education system. Is a superior way of approaching changes to education, trying to get better results out of our school system than is the usual approach, which inevitably and understandably results in states seeking to gain more money from the Commonwealth.
Sorry, Jim.
Crosby,
Sorry, Jim. Can I
go ahead. Go right ahead.
Can I just jump in? Sorry, there's a particularly pernicious lie that is being taken hold of. It was just repeated 2 seconds ago that there's been a large increase in school funding, and of course in the first year that we've measured subsequently there hasn't been a correspondingly large increase in the NAPLAN scores. I've got to say, from someone that studies this sort of thing on a regular basis, one data point is tragically insignificant and insufficient to draw any kind of conclusions. So I really do think there is a whispering campaign being led by people on the far right saying, oh, look, Gonski's failed, we've used the money, we've put the money in, nothing's happened, let's walk away from Gonski. They're using it to undermine one of the best, most comprehensive forms of school funding analysis in half a century because of one data point. I think that's completely wrong-headed.
Daniel Wild?
Well, to suggest that this is some sort of campaign from the far right ignores the fact that the government's own independent economic think tank, the Productivity Commission, raised issues about money going in and results coming out. The reality is, if you want to have more substantial improvements to the education system, we need to remove the duplicative overlaying structure of the federal and states both being involved, and decentralising and devolving power and responsibility to the states is the way to ensure that they'll be more responsive to the needs of parents and of students and getting Canberra out of giving directives to schools.
I don't disagree with that. What I'm saying is that you can't every 6 months or every year that you get a new data point come in, suddenly have whole-scale change and say, oh, here's a new strategy that we need to employ. For God's sakes, we've spent 3 years designing through David Gonski, you know, one of the most independent, respected businessmen in this country, figuring out this model. Let's give it time to work. Let's give it time to see what happens. And for God's sakes, let's fund it properly. Let's not fund 4/5 of it and say, oh, we did the whole thing. No, nonsense. Put the funding the way Gonski intended, and then let's measure the results over a 3 to 4 to 5 year period.
Daniel, there is this question of years 4 and 5, and certainly it was only the budget estimates that, the forward estimates that the current government has ever promised to fund, and that it does create problems for years 4 and 5, and does it not provide the time, as Sam Crosbie is suggesting, to get a fair assessment of what is underway?
That was one of the key issues, that the funding, similar in the way to some of the NDIS funding, was pushed outside of the forward estimates, meaning that it wasn't captured in the budget. The issue with this is it does get back to the issue of financial sustainability and how much money is actually being dedicated truly capturing that cost, both as we were talking before with welfare and also with education funding. I would note that a 14% increase per student over 10 years with very limited to no improvements in that plan and going backwards in some areas is not a single data point. It's a broader issue pertaining to the education system. And again, making sure that we devolve power to the states and not having two layers of government will go a long way to fixing some of the issues in the system.
Sam Crosbie, how much of a problem in this is this question of federal-state relations and the money being raised in one area and spent elsewhere, and of cost shifting, as it is in health, really making the entire system less productive and less efficient?
Look, there's no question that this country has a problem with its federalist model. We've got the highest rate of vertical fiscal imbalance. I think it's somewhere up to 91%, the highest rate of vertical fiscal imbalance in the world. Clearly, we need to sit down, not just in education, we need to sit down in a whole range of areas and actually figure out how we can give states more control over their own expenditure and, importantly, more control over their own revenue. You know, if a state wants to put up certain taxes, it should be free to do so. I don't think it's necessarily a good idea, as Malcolm Turnbull suggested immediately prior to the last election, to give them a state income tax. That I'm open to discussing. But to then say, but that's any money they raise in addition to what they're currently getting, we're going to deduct from the GST recipient. I just think that's completely wrong-headed. You need to have an honest conversation with them and sit down and work this thing through.
We just before we go, talking economics quite a bit, and I was very struck by some remarks of Ken Henry's in the Weekend Australian article by Paul Kelly this morning. Ken Henry, of course, the Secretary of Treasury at the time of the global financial crisis, helped Australia be shepherded through that very difficult economic time, but he's quite clearly now losing patience with both sides of politics, calculating that in terms of their commitments to running a surplus or balancing the budget through the cycle, and the commitments that they've made, that $6.3 billion in budget savings, which they did agree on, was something of a pinprick, and his calculation, or his economists, team of economists at the National Bank's calculation, is that still leaves a shortfall of some $360 billion. Sam Crosbie, we really are only touching the surface here, and it does leave Australia extremely vulnerable should there be a downturn globally.
Sure. Look, I actually had lunch with Ken on Friday, and he put this same proposition to me. I think he's absolutely right on the economics. I think he needs to have a little bit more optimism for the political class. I think the Labor Party learned a really valuable lesson during the last election, which was honest reforms, fiscally responsible reforms in the face of negative gearing. Fiscally responsible reforms are welcomed by the Australian public. Similarly, you go back a couple of elections ago, when Julia Gillard took the increase in the Medicare levy to fund NDIS or part fund NDIS to the Australian people, it was accepted without a blush. You know, we do have a revenue problem, we do have a spending problem in this country. And I do think the political will is being generated for both sides of politics to go out there and do something about this. And yes, I'm sorry for the IPA. That will require some degree of raising taxes somewhere along the line. You can't have it. You can't have the level of services that the Australian people are demanding of their government and not increase revenue somehow.
If the figure is $360 billion, as Ken Henry suggests, Daniel Wild, Sam is right. It's not going to all come from the savings side of the budget, is it?
Ken Henry is exactly right. The Omnibus Bill was a rounding error on a rounding error when we look at it in the context of $500 billion in debt. The Treasurer himself said we're getting towards $1 trillion in debt, unless substantial corrective actions taken in the budget, and $6.3 billion is not substantial. The key to getting the budget back under control is to generate more economic growth. Economic growth, of course, is good in the sense that it provides more employment prospects and a better economy and society, and of course it provides more revenue to the government as a happy ancillary consequence. And the way to do that, the way to generate economic growth, is to make sure we're getting regulation and red tape down. This is a big burden on industry, a big burden on businesses starting, and a big burden on entrepreneurs emerging from the economy. I would also we need to make sure that we're reducing our taxes on income and reducing our taxes on businesses so as to create more investment. Australia should aspire to be the most attractive destination on the planet to have businesses setting up here, and that means having a welcoming tax environment and a welcoming regulatory environment to generate economic growth.
Sam Crosbie, do you want to respond to that?
It's a lovely economic theory, and you know, back when we needed economic theories because you couldn't measure any of these things, ideas like that, you know, had currency. Frankly, it's been completely disproved. You know, you look at Malcolm Turnbull's last small business tax cut that he didn't want to say, but Treasury then belled the cat and they said yes, it was $55 billion worth. You can measure what happens when you cut taxes. It's not some sort of hypothetical, rhetorical argument you need to engage with. You can measure it. And unfortunately, cutting company tax just doesn't generate that same return that we need to cover up a $360 billion hole. You're not going to grow the economy sufficiently to do that. It's, you know, you don't have to take my word for it. Take Treasury's.
Daniel, there is something there. It's $360 billion if all the commitments and promises plus the current state of the budget are taken into account. Now, it may well be that cutting taxes is part of the equation, but to meet that task, it cannot surely all be done simply by reducing the tax burden on corporate Australia.
The simple reality is when you tax something, you have less of it. And when you subsidise something, you get more of it. Taxing work and taxing investment means you have less of it. Now, on the expenditure side, we do have issues with the duplication of responsibilities across state and federal governments. We need to be looking more fundamentally, do we need to have education, health and environment departments at the federal and the state level? This alone would generate a significant reduction in the expenditure in the Commonwealth budget, engaging in things such as welfare reform, such as education reform that is aimed at providing more targeted government programs to those who need it and those who are otherwise unable to provide for themselves, is another key area where budget savings can be made in a manner that also improves the employment prospects of those who are currently on welfare. So I think there are a number of ways in which the government could be looking, firstly, to generate economic growth, to get increased revenues, and secondly, to be trimming back on the federal role in our economy and in our society.
Look, there's plenty more to talk about this indeed, gentlemen. We haven't even got on to tax expenditures, and what about the diesel fuel rebate? And what about a cleaner corporate tax regime, for example? But we will have to leave it there for this Saturday. Sam Crosbie from the McKell Institute, thank you very much for taking some time with us this afternoon. Daniel Wild from the Institute of Public Affairs, likewise. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.